32 ticks following. So they are swallowing. Monkey is swallowing. Snake self swallowing. Next, a swallow 2 will fly and come and swallow. You're ever swallow in a hollow gallow, making a whole lot of halabaloo. Jale kalu, we know say you chop the money some, so give me the loot. Do you really want a revolution or just your turn? Cause if you really want a revolution, all this for Ben.
Welcome everyone to the Akin Arts and Book Festival 2020 online. I am Folu, most people know me as Folu Storms, and today I'll be moderating a very interesting panel discussion with Akin Oyebode, with Ojoma, Ochai, as well as Mr. Sunday Dari as well. We are going to be tackling the issue of unemployment in Africa, looking at the teeming youth. So welcome everyone, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
I'm good. Good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
Excellent.
Thanks for having me.
So very excited to be having this conversation. I think it's a very important one because the issue of unemployment across the African continent is a very serious one. And then now looking at the COVID-19 pandemic, how it's dealt with people in 2020, a loss of jobs, people really just trying to figure out how to move on from this situation. I think it is quite timely that we are having this discussion. I want to have this discussion in the most open, realistic, and practical way possible as well. As an elder millennial myself, as I like to think of myself, it is something that bothers me tremendously when we consider how very young the population across the continent is, but yet how many issues people have with finding employment in a sustainable and viable way. So I guess jumping into it, between the three of you are panelists, for those of you who are watching, they have decades, a whole wealth of experience, ranging from the creative sector, which Ojoma is very much involved in, to sports, which Sunday Dari is very involved in, to finance as well. And that's where Akintode's expertise comes in. So I'm going to delve into the financial area. I'll start with you, Akintode, because finance is always a tricky issue with people, financial literacy for a young Africa. But really, let's just start off with how you view what is clearly an unemployment and sometimes underemployment issue for young people across the continent. What are your thoughts?
I think fundamentally, it's how do we improve basic education? What I've seen over the last few years, first working with the Lagos State Employment Trust Fund and later with the state government, is even where the economy is growing and able to absorb new jobs, we need to provide the right skills for the people to take up those jobs. So you find that investment in vocational and technical education, investment in basic education that allows people the foundational skills and develop the cognitive ability, to work in different sectors. So one of the challenges also with the Nigerian labor market is that it's not dynamic enough to shift in tandem with the changing global economy. So if you look at our students today, how digitally aware are they? How computer literate are they? There are jobs opening up in things like business process outsourcing. We have jobs opening with just for annotation roles in artificial intelligence. These are large absorptive industries where we currently have little or no participation. So I think for me, the fundamental issues will be around, before we even talk about finance, it will be how do we first improve basic education? Of course, finance is a critical element and especially more important in a society that's supportive of entrepreneurship. And I often say, I'm happy that the Honorable Minister is with us today. I'm a very big fan of the youth fund that his ministry has just set up, because ultimately, young people have, in many instances, really great ideas, and are just unable to find the little financing required to turn those ideas into businesses. I will close by giving a little story of a guy we supported when I was at LSCTF. He was a Part 4 student in LASUT Teaching Hospital, the medical school at LASUT, and we gave him a loan of 250,000 naira for his laundry business. Not only did he pay back that loan in a year, that small business had employed 12 other people who were now washing and ironing clothes for him. But he also used part of his capital to seed his sister, who was unemployed at the time, to start, a smoothie business. So it does tell you that limited, little sums of money can really help in a market where unemployment and underemployment is approaching over 50% for young people. So I'm very keen to see things like the youth fund start up. But I also think that there's an opportunity for subnational governments to help crowd private capital into their economies. Ultimately, government can solve this problem, right? So if we're looking for money to improve the economy, if we're looking for money to fix infrastructure, it's going to be private capital, right? With the fiscal crisis, especially with the COVID-19 related fiscal crisis we currently have, what we must now start to think about as a country is how do we ensure that private capital is confident and comfortable enough to come in to solve some of these larger macro challenges? Because no matter what you do at a micro level, you still got to fix the overall macro issues. So I think I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Akin, today. You touched on a few things that definitely will come back to unpack because it's our luggage to unpack. But let's now segue over to Mr. Sunday Dare, please, our Minister of Youth and Sports Development. There was something that Akin today pointed out there about your involvement in the Youth Development Fund, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that and how you see unemployment with a sports angle and sports perspective.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I thank you also for making Akintunde speak before me, because he has done the heavy lifting for me. And I think that for me, the most excitement comes from the approval of the 75 billion for the Nigerian Youth Fund. And it came about because we found out, just like Akintunde said, that most of our youth are not funded. Access to credit and finance is cumbersome, non-existent. The commercial banks take between 8 to 14 months to even approve a loan of 5 million or 50 million or 20 million for our youth. They are frustrated. Oftentimes, they don't even know where to go because there's no dedicated fund from government. You just have a couple of programs and they say SMEs should apply. And we felt it was important because we did a couple of researches. We found out that across the world, no country has been able to solve the unemployment problem of its youth without turning the youth into entrepreneurs, without taking a risk or taking a bet, funding their ideas, just ideas alone, and then funding their enterprise or new businesses, SMEs and MSMEs, and of course, SMBs, small and medium businesses like Google now calls it. So the National Nigerian Youth Investment Fund is benchmarked between 250,000 to 50 million. Any Nigerian youth, educated, uneducated, can apply, show proof with a business plan, and then can be given a specific amount with a 1 to 2 year moratorium. But also, like Akin said, there's a problem with skills. Because without the necessary skills, how do you place yourself on the path of entrepreneurship? So on the other tangent, we're investing so much in upskilling Nigerian youth, about 500,000 of them. It has started already. We're going to ratchet up the numbers in the next 2 months all across the country. But I think we must agree that beyond Nigeria, we have a digital skills gap. Can see a collaborative effort from Google, IBM, Microsoft, MasterCard, all focusing on upskilling of our youth. But I think also the larger elephant in the room is a mismatch. That is, we must match the skills available or the skills that we want with the jobs that are available within the country. I think there are country to country specifics and peculiarities. And for us in rolling out any training model or the bouquet of digital tools training we want to do, we're very specific to look at a bouquet that is relevant within our country. I know there's the tangent of outsourcing, but the larger jobs are in this country. And we're trying to make sure that we match our training models with the skills that are marketable within the country.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. I'm definitely going to come back to you, Honorable Minister, to address exactly what you mean by the upscaling and what that looks like in practical terms and the sorts of skills and bouquets that are happening there. But Ojoma, when Mr. Dare spoke about the importance of funding the youth as entrepreneurs, that put me very much in mind of the creative sector, where we see a lot of young people who are, in a sense, acting in an entrepreneurial capacity on their own. And I wonder what your experience has been in young people in the creative sector growing, scaling up, and creating more job opportunities, and whether that's viable, what that looks like over the next 5, 10, 15 years. Ojoma, I would love for you to address that.
Thanks for that question. So when we talk about the creative industries, we're talking about industries like film and fashion and music and broadcasting, advertising, and so on and so forth. And we know that all over the world, that sector is a labor-intensive sector because every single project in film or music or fashion would employ a range of skill sets. And because, as you say, the barriers for entry are low, it means that it's almost like low-hanging fruit, right, to provide jobs. What we find, though, in Nigeria is that there's a real lack of diversity of skills in the creative industries. And so what I mean by that is that there's a lot of artistic skills, and so lots of talent. But then, as we know, the whole industry value chain needs to rely on a diversity of skills, whether it's in sort of business management, whether it's in fundraising, technical skills. So I think the biggest issue that we're finding with the creative industries is that those skills just don't exist in the creative industries. And so an accountant who's finishing school, an engineer who's finishing school, somebody that has done business administration who's finishing school is not looking at the creative industries as an opportunity for employment. So what you have, quite ironically, is lots of artists who are creating good content, making good work, but then that work is not finding markets because the sort of hard skills that can take those products to market is either the artist is doing it themselves or the creative person is doing it themselves. And so often there's that lack of focus, but there's also the lack of specialism. That means they're not getting as much return on investment as they would. Ironically, outside of the industry, those skills do exist, right? And lawyers, engineers, accountants are looking for work. So I think in terms of what needs to be done, we need to be crowding in a lot more diversity of skills into the creative industries, such that the range of disciplines that is required to turn what is often a bit of a small side gig, we can turn those into more viable businesses. I think that's one issue. There's something around core skills or what people call 21st century skills, that thing around creativity, critical thinking, initiative, social skills, that is not really taught in our basic education. Akin was talking about basic education and the quality of it. And I think it's a real issue because also, even when you do have people coming into those industries, because it's predominantly small businesses where you need a lot more flexibility and creativity than you would in a sort of, maybe that's arguable anyway, but you need that creativity and initiative to make things work. And so just that lack of strong basic education is also a stumbling block. But I think in terms of a USP, certainly off the starting block, and there's things that can be done to move us forward.
Okay, thank you for that. I love how everything comes back at the end of the day to basic education. Everyone has in one way or another touched on basic education, how it affects diversity of skill, how people are able to scale up from there. But what does this basic education look like? Because are we talking about literacy? Is it just math and English? Are we talking about financial literacy, which is something else? For perhaps a number of African countries, I can definitely speak for Nigeria as someone who went to primary school here. The basic education felt a lot like regurgitation. There's critical thinking wasn't really emphasized. And at what point does this basic education come in for young people? Well, if we're looking at a working age of about, let's say let's call it 18 for argument's sake, for whoever it is that wants to answer this question, I would love to know, what would you consider basic education that the African youth need right now to begin to tackle fundamentally this unemployment issue?
I'm happy to jump in. I think there's two sets of skills. I think there's foundational skills, as Akin was saying, which is numeracy and literacy. They're like basic things. You need to be able to read in a language. It doesn't have to be English. So literacy is one foundational skill, and numeracy, right? You need to be able to count the money that you're making. But seriously, I think numeracy and just that ability, numeracy, I suppose, as the name implies. So I think foundational skills are one set of skills. But then, as I've already said, core skills are another set of skills, which are not hard, but they're so important. There was some research by World Economic Forum a few years ago where they were talking about the 3 top skills for jobs in the next 10 years. And the number one skill was creativity. And I think in a country where we are aware, maybe a bit controversially, contrary to public opinion, we're not a wealthy country in the sense of it. I think creativity is the only way that we're going to be able to use the scarce resources that we have. And so I think that's a critical skill that young people are going to need to have. I think that the fund, for example, that the Honorable Minister is setting up is a wonderful example, but let's be real, right? It's not going to be enough for everybody. So I think that creativity and that ability to almost make something out of nothing, and I'm not suggesting that we live in poverty forever, but I think it's such a critical skill in such a country where there's so much lack. And because that's missing, it hasn't been taught. Sometimes it's instinctive, but it's like a muscle that you build and somebody has to teach it to you. So I think that's critical. And there's obviously changes we can make to the curriculum, but I think beyond that, increasingly, there's opportunities to learn it in your sort of later life, whether it's through the internet, whether it's through courses that are provided by the Honorable Minister was talking about programs that Google, Microsoft, and various other people are doing. I think there's a lot of opportunity now more than ever before for people to gain those skills. And it's about raising awareness, right? Because people don't know what they don't know. So if they don't know that they need this particular skill, how are they going to learn it? So I think there's something about us raising the awareness for people to recognize what skills are most needed and sort of signposting them to where they can achieve.
Does anyone else want to jump in on that?
I mean, I think Ojoma has really made the point. But I guess for me, there's also one more thing to add to that conversation. You know, there's got to be some, if we look continent-wide, there's got to be also some scalability around what we learn. So you want something that's scalable, that's got some level of consistency, that allows you work to a certain level in different countries within Africa. So I guess it's also saying, yes, numeracy, literacy, fundamental, but as we move up towards higher education, you know, how do we also standardize some of these things in the curriculum? That it doesn't really matter. So the West African Examination Council, for example, had a pretty decent crack at this, where, you know, you generally know that if you're within a wide country, there's some basic things that you learn, whether it's in Nigeria or Ghana or Gambia or Sierra Leone. And it's that consistency that helps. So that if a Nigerian wants to export his skills to Ghana or to Senegal, you know, at least within even the sub-regional context, you know, there are basic elements that Ghanaian employers or Nigerian employers have in common. Because at the end of the day, if we're going to lift the continent, we're going to have to look beyond individual countries, right? We're going to have to do things that allow us trade. And the biggest thing we're trading, after all, is talent, right? So it's going to be things that allow us trade with each other and allows people move their skills within their, I'll say, their residential jurisdiction. So, but I think, Ojoma, nothing really to add. Those are the foundational skills that we're looking for. But over and above that, to now start to make people a lot more employable. So technical and vocational education, for example, you know, can these certifications be standardized, you know, across, even if not across the continent at once, but at least first up across the sub-region, so that when a Nigerian tailor or a tiler, you know, can work in Ghana and a Ghanaian can work in Nigeria, and you have that mobility of labor that people can find work, you know, across countries within the continents, it definitely starts to improve how much work is available to those people.
Mr. Darren, was there something you wanted to add to it?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that both of you have spoken well, but I think we're dealing with very fundamental issues here, because we can either start addressing it from the fruits on the tree or from where the seed was sown. Fundamentally, our educational policy is flawed, because you want to dissect it and look at what is the content when it comes to the percentage that is focused on technical and vocational skills. We have a generation of youth that just believe simply running through a 4-year, 5-year program in the universities and colleges, having a certificate, doing a youth service is enough to earn you a place in the job market. That is no longer possible, at least in the last 5, 7, 8 years. And that's why the number of unemployed youth is over 2.5 million that enter the job market unable to find jobs. So it boils down to really looking at our educational policy in a very realistic way, building up the STEM content of that increasing the number of technical schools that we have, also changing the orientation of teaching in our universities. For instance, in Germany, I do know that if you are in college for a university degree, at least 1 day or 2 days in a week, you have to leave the classroom to go to that particular industry to do some practicals. Beyond what you do in the laboratories, you go to the manufacturing industries, production lines, and you gain practicals. By the time you're out of the university, you have your certificate, but also you've learned skills. And that's why you look at the level of unemployment in Germany, it's not as huge as we have in our country. So there's a fundamental question. But also, do we have also the stimulating environment for these ideas to sprout and grow? We don't.
Yeah.
And the lesson comes from China, for instance. China, about 4 years ago, they shut down over 150 universities and turned them into technical colleges. And then the idea of creativity comes. And that's why all over the world, to the smallest toys and the most sophisticated technology equipment, they're made in China because they place a lot of emphasis on hands-on, what you can do with your brain, with your hand, skills. Of course, talent comes in, a medley of talent and skills. And whatever is produced, the level of uptake is high. For instance, I met a girl from Canada, a Nigerian. She's in Lagos. She developed a COVID-19 detective instrument. Once you enter and they say this hall is for 50 people, the moment you enter and you're the 51st person, there's a sensor she developed that just sounds an alarm, an annoying alarm, just like a fire alarm. And then it alerts everybody and they say, what's wrong? But also she went ahead and added another layer. She developed a sensor for face mask. So if you walk through the door, she did about 5 different sensitive materials for face mask. If you walk through the door and you're not wearing a face mask, or it's not covering your face, the alarm comes on. She developed this 2 months ago. I stumbled into her. Why is this not out there? There was no uptake. She couldn't just even find any bank or company to take it up and commercialize it. But when you look at China, they have these young kids packed up in a place. They spend 5 months, 5 years, they come up with something. There's an uptake, they develop it, manufacture it, and it's all over the world, and we're buying it. So I think that's also important. But by and large, I think the government has a major role to play in terms of we shouldn't be afraid with the realities of the digital economy. COVID-19 also is teaching us some hard lessons. We shouldn't be afraid to take a stab, and we should not be dogmatic about the educational policy that we have. Yes, we have a bit of elements of STEM, of technical education here and there, but we need to take a bold step and increase the dosage and the depth of technical education, the emphasis, the funding in a very deliberate way. Unless we're deliberate in the next 5 years, we will not bring down the numbers, we will not solve our problems, and then we'll be dependent on the technology from outside.
Sadari, thank you so much. You've touched on so many issues that have me wanting to jump out of the screen and just say, yes, this is what we're talking about. One of the big ones, policy. The way policy affects how education is run in this country, I think is a very big deal. Perception as well of certain types of jobs, what people consider to be dignified labor, not dignified labor. It's quite fascinating. The creative industries and sectors that we see blossoming and that have blossomed perhaps in the last 10 years. I personally can attest, and I know a lot of creative individuals can attest to the struggle, even within family units, within educational institutions, for that choice to go in that direction, because for a long time people didn't see it necessarily as viable. But what will it take for these policies to actually be instituted, for it to move forward? Because I do also remember a time in my lifetime and in yours when made in China was a dirty phrase almost, but now it's just the reality around the world. Almost everything is made in China. And we do have the manpower, we do have the number of people, but how can policy be adjusted so that we can really see this kind of change? And are we going to see this kind of change in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years? And having said that, also, Akin, today you did also touch on the importance of looking at African-wide solutions so that we can trade and we can move freely across borders. But is there also an issue of perhaps a fundamental lack of trust between countries? Because even down to trade agreements, when it comes out in the press, there's a lot of back and forth and how people feel about it. Oh, why it will open up to all sorts of things coming in that we don't want. And I wonder what I could say your thoughts are on that as well. So looking at policy and how it affects the type of education we need and how to shift the mindset and the perspectives of people who at the moment are even employers of labor, people who are in charge of the universities, people who are in charge of policy making. What do you think about that?
I'll start with the policy element to it. So with things like innovation, with things like research, we've got to ensure that universities are able to commercialize some of the research work that goes on in there. In agriculture, for example, there's a lot of interesting work going on improving the quality of seeds, on things like soil management and soil testing, on improved planting methods. These are things that ultimately increase the productivity of what is Nigeria's biggest employer of labor today. Okay, so this is part of the policy conversation, right? So broadband connectivity for me has been a big problem, as you can see today. The first step for me is states must figure out how do we get better internet connectivity across the country. So it's critical that we deepen connectivity, because without connectivity, we really can't reach the innermost parts of Nigeria. Whatever pedagogy, whatever curriculum can be better delivered if we can adopt a lot more technology. So for me, there's a conversation around how do we deepen technology? How do we deepen connectivity? If there's one policy element that I would like to see change, it's getting better broadband penetration across Nigeria, period. If there was one thing I was going to ask to change. States have started to do things like that. I mean, a number of us have removed, the exorbitant costs around laying fiber optic cables. And we hope that starts to improve not just the penetration, but the quality of broadband connectivity we see across Nigeria. The second point for me, which you talked about around trade, is yes, trade agreements are usually knotty issues, right? But ultimately, we need to recognize that we have to grow the pie. So at the end of the day, no matter how small, no matter how much work we do, if the pie is still as small as we see it today, then there's only so many jobs that we can create from a local economy. Nigeria, especially, if I go to my country, has to be a lot more export focused. And I always like to use the creative industry as a great example of being export focused. So if you think about music, the Wizkids and the Davidos and the Burna Boys of today and the Tiwa Savage and Yemi Alade are not big artists because they're Nigerian artists alone, right? It's because their music has now traveled across the continent, across the world. I was very interested, about almost a decade ago, when I learned that Yemi Alade was such a big deal outside of Nigeria. At the time, I only knew maybe one or two of her songs, right? But she was a massive big deal across the continent, and that's creating new markets for these young people. If you take the visual art industry, for example, one of the artists said to me, 10 years ago, if I wanted to have an exhibition, I'll call all the other artists and say to them, nobody must exhibit in August because I have an exhibition that month. The reason for that was the buying community was all of maybe 40 or 50 people, right? But today, Nigerian art has traveled. And when you look at, collectors in New York, collectors in Miami, collectors across the world, you see Nigerian art hanging on their walls. It's allowed those people earn more money. It's allowed those people employ more people. And to your point around signaling, it's allowing even parents recognize that if my son says, I want to draw, it's no longer because he's lazy. It's because there's a real industry there. There's a real career there, and that's why we're seeing more and more. It's not an accident that we're seeing more and more middle-class kids jump into music, right? Because all of a sudden the parents are like, oh, this is not because there's nothing else you can do. This is because there's a real opportunity here. There's a real career to be built here. So that's what, and all of those things are only possible because there are export markets available for those artists. So I'm definitely a big fan of saying, yes, put some of the protection around trade, right? You can have certain rules and clauses that limits things like dumping, things like transshipments, but these things are even more on the manufacturing side of things. On the creative side of things, to be honest, you really can't stop a movement whose time has come. You can't really say to me, oh, I mustn't listen to Sauti Sol, right? Or I mustn't listen to Ali Kiba, or, someone from Kenya, I mean, these things are easily accessible on mobile devices. And that for me is how technology helps. Ojoma might remember, a few years ago, we had long conversations around piracy. How do we help the music industry distribute a lot better? Nobody talks about that today, because today, Burna Boy's album drops at midnight. Thanks to Apple Music, at 12:01, millions of people have already started listening to it and started streaming it. Burna Boy is already earning the revenues of that album immediately. All of this couldn't have happened in the old Alaba days, where you had to go and sell CDs and lobby someone to say they should not print more than, or they should not remake more than 500,000 copies of an album, etc. That thing has fallen away, which goes back to where I started this conversation from. That just improving broadband connectivity for me will be like the single biggest policy objective that government can deliver. Thank you.
Maybe I can jump in there from broadband.
Please.
Yeah, because in my prior life, I was an executive commissioner with the Nigerian Communications Commission, and I was in charge of stakeholder management. But also, I know that while I was there, government did a couple of things. For the first time, they designed what we call the Infraco license. That is infrastructure license, mapped across the country to have 6 Infraco companies that will lay cables, fiber optic cables, across the country. Fortunately, unfortunately, what we have now, we have the resource, the bandwidth that we need, Glo1, Sat1, and all of that, they are on our shores, but we don't have the infrastructure to distribute them interland that will take it to the last mile. And I think what Akin is talking about and the experiences having now is because of the last mile connectivity. But I think the Infraco companies have already started work. It's a network that plugs into each other from the southwest to the southeast to the northwest and all around the country. And I think if that is accelerated, we can see improvement. You see, technology has become an enabler. And unless any country puts in the necessary resources, all of these things we're talking about, the excitement, the skills we want to give the kids, they're online. They want to market them, it's online. They want to outsource them, they must have this connectivity. It's really critical. But I think that beyond that, we have seen efforts around other policy areas that can help us plug into the 21st century digital economy. And COVID-19 has clearly shown us, or has accentuated the level of collaborations between the public and the private sector. I've had brilliant experiences with IBM when during the lockdown, the youth were practically doing nothing. And I worked with IBM to say, can we take all the plans we have for offline training and turn it into online training? Can we develop 25 training models? Can we have an e-learning platform? And we did that. And within 2 months, we're able to train over 15,000 youth. And that is increasingly expanding. Of course, that's also dependent on broadband connectivity. But I agree with you, whatever we're doing, we need policy to drive technology, policy to drive broadband connectivity. The bandwidth should be good and the speed should be also okay. But I think we have an opportunity to deepen the public-private partnership. And through that process, there will emerge certain models and documentation that can be fed into the government policy process. I haven't had the experience of implementing such partnerships. We can now develop them and put them into the government policy process such that government can embrace them and make sure that it's available nationally and funded through the budget.
Okay, very, very interesting. Yes, broadband penetration is important, but you're also right. I can say nothing can really stop the movement whose time has come. But with regards to Infraco, Honorable, it'd be very interesting to know what kind of timelines we're looking at for this penetration to happen, especially considering in light of COVID-19, that in situations where I know we're in a country that people like to push a lot of paper. You do some things online, you go to certain institutions, they still want you to print out paper and fill it in. But the pandemic forced everyone to deal online. And I look at access to the internet, access to broadband connection as creative oxygen. And Ojoma, I wonder how this because you did mention that because of the pandemic as well, some of the things that the work that you had in progress, which you're scaling it up, and I would love to know what that is looking like, especially now that we're 6 months in, 7 months in. How are young people adjusting to it, and what are the opportunities that are really opening up? Because we know that the pandemic scared the bejesus out of everybody. People were really worried that it's doom and gloom. But interestingly enough, in the conversations and in different ways, you've all mentioned potential opportunities and things that the pandemic has highlighted. So I wonder in the creative sector, whether it's finance, whether it's music, or whether it's film, what's opening up, Ojoma, and what are the policies that are actually in place right now to help people scale up and get more of this creative oxygen?
Thanks for that. I think Akin raises a very good point about when he was talking about distribution of music, in that a lot of the consumption that we're seeing with creative content is online. So whether that's on, I don't know, Apple Music or other channels, a lot of it is increasingly online. I suppose it's both an opportunity and a threat. I was reading some months ago this research that said that 82% of the growth in the creative industries in Nigeria will come from online and internet-based innovation. Within that, obviously, being distribution. But I suppose that point about you can't really stop anybody from listening to Sauti Sol or whoever else. It means that even though it's creating opportunities, it's also creating competition. So I think that there's something around policy that's maximizing the capacity of young people to exploit the opportunities that are opening up. So it's things like, technical skills, as we've already talked about, for production. When you're thinking of content making, for example, do young people have the scalable? Akin was talking about scale. We have lots of small interventions that are useful for 100 people, 200 people, and so on and so forth. But does it really empower them to actually take advantage of the opportunities that open up? I think we need to relook at the metrics that we use to measure success. And we ourselves are guilty as this, as the British Council and various institutions, UNESCO and others that I support, where we're counting the number of inputs, if you like. So we've trained 25,000 people. How many of those have got jobs as a result of that training? How many of those have taken advantage of the platforms as a result of the skills that they've achieved? So I think we need to change our metrics for measurement, because if the problem is jobs, then what we should be counting is jobs that people are getting, or the work that people are getting. I think also there's something about career advice, which we also don't talk about a lot, right? Because we assume that somehow by osmosis, people will just know all of the opportunities that are emerging. So I think also that's something that technology can do. And beyond even online, I'm thinking about radio, television. How do we use those channels to open up people's awareness of just the breadth of possibility that exists? And without knocking anybody, you look at numbers, streaming numbers for certain kinds of content, and you wonder, because on one hand, we say broadband is expensive and so on, but who are the people that are watching this content that are racking in millions of views and millions of SMSs sent to contribute to the discussion? And how can we channel that energy? And I'm not saying it's bad, don't get me wrong. I'm saying if we've got a problem and we are seeing indications elsewhere that there's infrastructure or there's capability to take advantage of the opportunities that exist, how do we channel that energy by raising people's awareness of what is possible through those channels? And then I suppose my final point is about the fact that I personally feel that there's too much government intervention in many areas where the market should be determining. And I think that obviously with two government people on the panel, maybe that's too controversial to say. I think that the government, it's not scalable. The resources of government are limited. So I feel like because government is trying to solve too many problems directly, you then get a situation where there's overburdening, say, of the taxpayer, because oil is getting cheaper, the price of oil is getting lower, so we need to tax the citizens more because government is taking on too much. And it's counterintuitive. It means that the provision is not effective, it's not efficient, and then the market fails because there's too much intervention in what the market forces should be driving. Again, if we go back to that example about music and distribution, I feel like until these market forces have stepped in and solved the distribution problem. We were waiting for Film and Video Censors Board to go and be burning CDs in Alaba, and that never worked. And I think that's just a small example that sometimes you just need to empower the market to make things work, because that's where you get scale, and that's where the employment opportunities therefore for young people then come in. I've made quite a few disjointed points, but yeah.
They're very interesting ones, possibly shots fired there. A lot of government intervention. But Mr. Sunday Direct did talk about the importance and the opportunity for public private partnerships to happen, for the private sector to get a little bit more involved. But maybe there's something there a little bit in what Ojoma was talking about perhaps confidence in government intervention or government support, and how that may roll on. There was something else that came up. Yes, in talking about opportunities as well, I'd like to talk a bit about sports. In Nigeria, when we speak of, and I'm using a Nigerian example, but perhaps you could extrapolate across the continent, a lot of the time when we talk about sports, actually what comes to mind is football. And I find that particularly interesting and perhaps a little bit worrisome, looking at what happens across the world. Jamaica, that has got quite a small population compared to what we have, is producing some of the best sprinters in the world consistently, because of the level of investment, I guess, that they're making into their young people. And we have got such raw talent that I wonder what's happening in that direction, because sports is, I mean, globally, we know that it does bring in attention, it brings in awareness, it brings in so much. And I wonder that if there are policies in place, what is the government doing to create that awareness? How many radio stations are they reaching out to in places like Lagos that are heavily influential? And again, extrapolating this across the continent so that the young people who have access to these devices, because like Ojoma said, we're watching certain shows, numbers are going up for voting, people are engaging and they're paying attention to what interests them. But quite often what I find is that when government is moving policy in a particular direction, the language is very highfalutin. It goes above the head of the target market or the people who it should be speaking to directly. The language tends to speak actually to people who are used to speaking technical policy speak. And I wonder, Minister, what you can say about that.
Thank you very much. That's quite a loaded question.
Yes, very loaded.
And I hope I can return to Ojoma. She just tackled those of us in government, and I'd like to tackle her back, that there's too much government in all of this. And then she took us back to elementary economics, where they taught us repeatedly, allow the market forces to make that determination. I think there are lessons learned already. If you look at under this regime, there are lessons learned. In as much as there's so much government, we've also seen a deliberate effort encouraging ministers and heads of agencies and the rest to deepen public-private partnership. In fact, every ministry is mandated to develop a model of public-private partnership. The retreat we had 2 weeks ago, we had the World Bank report, and they mentioned 3 key things that countries must do post-COVID. One of those that stood out is that every country must deepen public-private partnership, especially when it comes to infrastructural development and also youth, upskilling the youth across the globe, that every country must leverage and deepen that partnership. And I think that government, the Nigerian government is working in that direction. For instance, I superintend over a Ministry of Youth and Sports Development where the budget is parlous. It's just 2.7 billion every year. That is like a drop in the bucket. You have 67 to 70 million youth. You have the sports, it costs a lot. So what we've done is in the last 1 year, we have been able to identify, sign MOUs with 7 strategic implementation partners, both in sports development and youth development. And we've seen the benefit of that. COVID-19 disrupted that flow, but we're picking up again. But let me talk about sport, what has been done. And it's true you talked about Jamaica, and I think that since I came in, the Jamaican story is one story that has really challenged me as a minister. But beyond that, you go to Brazil, you go to South Africa, you go to United Kingdom and the US, and you look at the whole ecosystem of sports as an industry. In spite of the fact that these countries produce the stars, win the gold, they've also developed the value chain of sports. Globally, sports is an industry that brings in $1.3 trillion every year. In the UK, it's about 41 billion to 43 billion pounds every year. In the US, it's around 44, 45 billion US dollars. In Nigeria, it's just about 350 million. So we've spent the last 10 months trying to develop a business model around our sports, where the sportsmen and women get value added to their skills, where investors can come in, driven by policy, where the value chain, you have merchandise production, can come up. So just 4 weeks ago, the draft policy called the National Sports Industry Policy was put in the public for all stakeholders to read what we have put together and come back with their comments, their views, criticisms, and then we work towards getting a sports industry policy with a business model built around it. In June, we were able to secure for the first time a reclassification of sports from mere recreation to business. The NBS classifies sports as recreation, as just mere service. Sports development for us largely has been just funding international competitions, Olympics, Commonwealth, all African Games, Commonwealth Games and all of that. But that's not sports development.
Yeah.
And that is possible because we do not have a business model built around our sports. So we've come far. We've kind of built our sports model on three key things we call the 3 I's, driven by 1 P. That 1 P is the policy. And that policy must have the 3 I's in it, embedded in it. The first I is infrastructure. There's a need for infrastructural rationalization if you want to an enduring sports development that can generate income, place value on our athletes, and also sharpen their skills. The second is investment. Both public and private sector must bring in the funds. But to attract investment from the private sector, government must also invest in a deliberate way. The third one is incentive. And the incentive is around the tax policy, the tax holidays, and other incentives that government must be deliberate about to make sure that a lot of our youth get into the sporting pipeline, but also investors can also come in. It's been proven from our research, sports as business in this country in the next 10 years can start to deliver between 4 to 7% to our GDP. Sports as business industry in the next 10 years, because we have a 10-year plan, can start to deliver between 2 to 4 million jobs across the value chain of sports as an industry. But beyond that, it can open up a new revenue track for the government. Sports can begin to generate revenue for the government. And this is research-based. So I think that we need policy to drive this. So far, we've been able to put together a draft policy. We hope that by the end of the year, this policy will get approved by the Federal Executive Council, and then we can have sports as business. And what that would do is going to unleash the potentials that we have. Beyond the mass of our youth are involved in sports, but beyond that, it's going to also open up the pockets of the private sector to come in. We've seen what has happened in other countries. We don't really even have to reinvent the wheel. It's just clear. There's certain things you need to put in place. We must bring content back. We watch the EPL, we watch La Liga all the time. Where's the content of our sports? Our domestic league, professional league is not on television. It's content stupid. So we're also deliberately making sure that we provide content, but we need private investors to come in. So the whole perception around sport as recreation is being changed gradually. We're marketing sports now as a viable industry where you can invest and get returns. Unless you can invest and get returns, nobody's going to step in. Some people are in cement business, rice business, and all of that is because they can invest and also get returns. And I think we have a handle on that, and we hope that Nigeria can join Jamaica, Brazil, South Africa, and other countries to be able to reap a lot from sports development.
Ojoma makes a point that I think the Honorable Minister and I have made even in this session. At the end of the day, first thing is there's some areas where these are public goods, right? Government must participate in some of these areas. So we talk about basic education. Basic education is largely unprofitable, right? And if you were going to make it profitable, then it won't be affordable for some of our poorest people, right? So areas where we have to intervene: security, healthcare, basic education. I mean, those are areas that government will play an active role. But I think some parts of the industry where, of course, private capital has to lead, the policies are now in place in some areas to help private capital lead. So if you take things like broadband penetration, right, what states will do is reduce the cost of right of way. What the NCC will do is create the framework that then allows telcos and other service providers, provide broadband connectivity at affordable prices. So I definitely agree that yes, government can't do it alone. I always say that Nigeria has a tax to GDP ratio in single digits, right? So not only the fiscal elements weak, it's also not a rich country, right? So we are not, per capita, Nigeria is a relatively poor country, right? So government can't intervene too much in too many sectors. I think that point, there's no point debating that, right? Under Prime Minister John Major, the UK started to invest a lot of lottery revenues in school sports. It was a deliberate investment in school sports. He was not acknowledged for the work he did, but if you see the UK's performance at the last Olympics, the UK had its best performance in decades from the investment that was made 20 years ago, because the kids that were the elite sports men and women that were trained and supported through that program have now become global stars. We're seeing it now in UK's performance in cycling, in boxing, in athletics. And so some of the work that the Ministry of Youth and Sports Development is doing now, the Honorable Commissioner might be, a wizened old man by the time we see the results. But it's important to always recognize that you build in generations. You don't build in 4 or 5 year spells. So a lot of the things that are happening and that I hear happening now are things that we'll only see, the results in 20, 25 years. So we mustn't be too quick, to ask for results. And that's one of the challenges that we have with policy making. To the broader point around policy, is that we start to think about policies as things that you must start and see the results within your term in office. I think just to hammer the points, Ojoma, you're not attacking two government officials. I think we generally agree with the point that private capital has to be enabled, and enabling private capital is our job as government, and that's what we're doing. That's what the Ministry of Youth and Sports Development is doing. That's what many states in the federation are doing. And so the point is absolutely taken. There's nothing to antagonize about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Akin. I think you also mentioned something very important about the length of time in reality that real change takes. For any policies that are implemented now to be seen and the effect of such policies to be seen, it does take time. And we do have a tendency as a people across the continent to want to see it now, perhaps because certain aspects have caught up with us quicker, because perhaps access to technology. And when we compare ourselves to what's happening in the rest of the world, especially with the media, and let's be quite frank, a lot of the media is very Western gazing. So it quite often plays up some of the difficulties that we have here. And I also noted as well the points of baggage that comes with certain ministerial positions, bad investments made over the years, and now just that slow, painstaking process. So I think that's something very important actually for all of us to think about, that it is a bit of a process. It is going to take some time. It's really encouraging to hear that there are all these policies and considerations that are going into place, and to have people like you, Akin, today, as well as Honorable Dare, who are forward thinking and who are trying to implement new ways to move forward. I know that we are coming a little bit close to the end of time, but there is a question that came in from South Africa from Lucky Mohine Makwa, who asks, and it's a general question, so anyone can pick up on this, but how do we deal realistically and viably with the steady daily rising rate of unemployment across the continent? I know in different ways you've kind of touched on this, but that is a direct question. Are we looking at this daily rising rate based on the metrics? What metrics are we using to assess our people? Is it African centric, or again, is it very Western gazing? It would be great if all of you could touch on it, but whoever wants to go first, I'm open to that.
The question of steady rising employment. So the average literacy rate in Nigeria is about 57%. the literacy rate in Lagos is 92%, maybe. The percentage of public schools in Lagos as a proportion of the total is 25%. So 75% of the education provision in Lagos State is private. So I don't want to belabor the point, and I don't want to antagonize the government people, but I think that even that notion that some things are public good, I think in a country like Nigeria, sometimes the solution might seem counterintuitive. As you've seen from these stats, if 75% of private provision is correlating to some of the highest, then I think there's something fundamentally wrong with that argument that government should be providing education. I think if we took Lagos as a case study and thought about the fact that they only have 25% of the public schools, but the Ministry of Education's preoccupation is about monitoring standards, policy, then what we're getting is a much better outcome where the provision is more efficient, is more adequate, the quality is more effective, and you're getting this literacy outcome, which itself correlates to Lagos having one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country. So I just wanted to make that point before
Okay, girl, we'll see you.
I think to this point about unemployment, I think that the point that was made earlier about exports and widening our gaze beyond what the Nigerian markets can offer, I think is a critical one. And we've talked about digital a lot, and both Akin and the Honorable Minister have talked about it. And I think even with sports, for example, esports is $1 billion industry and it's growing. And I think that one of the things that Nigeria does have is young people that are digitally literate increasingly and digitally savvy. How can we transfer some of that energy into these digital opportunities that exist? So I think for me, how do we solve that problem steadily? I think we need to enhance the sort of net and cast the net wider beyond opportunities in the country, and infrastructure, education, investment, incentives, as we've all talked about, as the Honorable Minister has said with sports, but as Akin has also said, I think those are the key so that people are tapping into opportunities that are beyond the sort of limits of our geography.
Let me quickly return to a point Ojoma made much earlier when she talked about the emphasis on training, digital training has been on for like 3-4 years. And then she posed the question, after training them, what do we do with them? We should stop counting the numbers of those who have trained. Rather, we should be counting the jobs created. And I think even within government circles, that has been a sore point to say, we train, we keep talking about training. How do we uptake some of these that have been trained in private sector, in public sector? And what we have done so far is to kind of develop an end-to-end for every training we're doing, not just in my ministry, but also in other ministries. It's an end-to-end process that training must end or lead to enterprise. And that's one way of tackling the youth unemployment. Don't train for training's sake. We want to count the jobs. And for me, the big word there is entrepreneurship. If you train, you end up making them self-starters. You also give them the necessary funding they need to be wealth creators, employers of labor. And I think that's one of the major keys. I looked at the Asian example, and I speak of Thailand, for instance, had a massive unemployment problem, and it's available online. And what they did was to create a special fund for the youth of their country. Challenge them that if you have innovative ideas, business ideas, products, enterprise, you step forward. But also make sure that the access to funding, to credit facility, was quite smooth and fast. And then another layer, before you can access any of these funds, you must go through a 30 to 45-day business management, financial management, etc. training. At the end of 4 years, unemployment rate of the youth dropped by over 65%. As we speak today, unemployment amongst youth in Thailand is single digit. There's a lesson from Thailand. Finally, as a youth minister, I have seen that our youth do not apply themselves to the opportunities out there, either for training, either for upskilling, either for assessing opportunities, both job opportunities and educational opportunities. They do not apply themselves to the process. They simply want to wait to be handed over. And I know I may get attacked. Our youth, most of them don't apply themselves to the process. For them, anything government can work. The private sector is overburdened. I am a product of applying myself when I was a youth to the opportunities available both online and offline. I went to New York University, Harvard University, Oxford University, because I applied myself to opportunities that were online and I took advantage of them. We launched a program in November. By December, when I was in Akure, where the African young entrepreneurs held a meeting, 7,000 young Africans from across the continent. And I asked them, have you heard about the deal program that the Ministry of Youth and Sports launched? Only one person had heard about it. We had opened up a platform, people could apply, you get 3 months internship, you'll be paid for those 3 months, and the opportunity of being retained was massive. We had 5,000 slots. They didn't know about it. And I said, you have smartphones. Study shows they spend between 6 to 7 hours online. And I said, what do you do online these 7 hours if you can't find opportunities like ours? So I said, okay, let's all Google Ministry of Sports and then DEEL. Let's see what comes up. I did it. And then it came up, 7 different search results showing the opportunities available. I said, so 90% of you don't know about these opportunities, yet you're connected to the internet. What do you do online? So we need a bit of discipline. Our youth must smarten up, but they need to also have a bit of discipline because they also have a part to play in helping to reduce the unemployment rate. Government on its part is opening up several opportunities and platforms. And I'm sure if we stay through to the plans we have in the next 24 months, we can turn that trajectory to reduce the unemployment rate amongst our youth.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I can say, did you want to jump in on anything very quickly? You've got a couple of minutes.
Oh, definitely. First, let me clarify to Ojoma quick points before I talk about just one example of how to reduce unemployment. So my point around education is, and we can have a long debate about, micro numbers on one state out of 36, right? My point around certain elements that will be termed social services are elements where people cannot afford the private cost of providing quality education. So we could argue about the quality of the education being provided by these private schools, some of whom you see their buildings collapsing every day within the state you've mentioned. That's a debate for a different day. So I just wanted to stress the point that government's intervention will be in areas that it considers critical and where you want to support a mass number of people who are unable to pay for private services. But I think ultimately the conversation today is around capitalization. It's around ensuring that people can be the best they are with the abilities they have, regardless of background, regardless of pedigree. And that's a continent-wide conversation. I think one thing I've learned is government must just, across the continent, listen to the private sector a lot more. And I know that I'm now arguing the other side of the point I made a minute ago. But one of the lessons I learned from my time at the Lagos State Employment Trust Fund was when we ran an employability program. That program started with calling in private employers and saying, what skills do you look for and you're unable to find? And if we were to invest in providing these skills to these people, will you hire them? And ultimately, we trained under that program at the time about 4,000 people, and we're able to put over 2,000 of them in jobs within 6 months. So that was a 50% success rate, employment rate, within 6 months of a learning program, right? So for me, that tells you what happens when government and the private sector tend to work together. And sometimes it's not even both sides putting capital in. It's just removing the information asymmetry between government and private enterprise. It's saying, what are the things you need to grow this pie? Because ultimately, to answer the question from South Africa, we have to grow the pie. And by growing that pie, it means bringing more private capital. We must encourage private capital, even on the continent, to invest in multiple countries. and we must allow people trade. We must recognize that Nigerian businesses must be able to operate in Kenya. So some of the challenges we see with extreme protectionism across the continent, we have to resolve. Because other than that happening, we will solve the pockets of problems, some pockets of problems in our respective countries, but across the continent, we'll still have bigger issues. So I'm a big fan of the Continental Free Trade Agreement, and I certainly can't wait to see that agreement come on stream. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This has been a very interesting conversation. I could definitely go on a bit longer, but we have come to the end of the session. I will make one final point that yes, the young people do need to pay a little bit more attention to the possible opportunities that are out there. Do your research. The internet is literally creative oxygen. It is business oxygen. Opportunities abound. But I will also point out to the slightly elder millennials who themselves have now become parents and are becoming parents. If young people are waiting for things to be handed to them, it is because there's a whole generation that taught them that behavior. So if we want to see different, we've got to do different. Thank you very much, Ojoma. Thank you so much, Sunday. Thank you very much, Akin today. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I've been Folu. You can find me online as Folu Storms. And that concludes our discussion, the Teeming Youth Tackling Unemployment Across the African Continent for the Ake Arts and Book Festival 2020, the online edition. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you ever need a new place to go, you can join me in a world of words. When it seems like I'm nowhere to be found, if you look, you'll find me in a book. Let's take a ride to the past in the back of a phoenix. Let's float around the moon. You'll never be alone, now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the world in a book. You'll never be alone, now you know where to look. Find me, find you, find the world in a book.
Stranger's Guide is not a typical American travel magazine. Our mission is to dive deep into a single location, commissioning work from great writers and photographers, famous individuals, as well as up-and-coming new voices. This year, we decided to go to Lagos. And we are proud of the volume we produced, with original work from some of Nigeria's best writers and photographers, working with luminaries like Wale Soyinka, Molara Wood, and Femi Kuti. We think this is a very special volume, and we're so excited to bring it back to Lagos.
Sticky, spicy, sweet.
Oh yeah, I want to go then. Don't touch me.
I will get you arrested. Very, very easy. Relax, everybody.
He shot you.
That 5 minutes madness only you can understand. Visit myspectre.com to get your Spectre experience. Spectre, loans in 5 minutes.